welcome to the Youth Forum podcast, a show designed to give youth a voice and to give an opportunity for people to share their views on important social issues. Today's topic, the importance of politics for youth. Understanding politics means understanding the effects that your vote has, as well as understanding the effects that an elected government has on our society. Politics are important because it helps people comprehend the rights that they have, helps provide people with an understanding of what they are voting for, helps people gain an understanding of government function, and helps individuals understand their personal beliefs as well as how they want to see those beliefs reflected in the government. Polls taken by StatsCan in 2020 showed that 69% of youths 17 and older were very likely to vote in the next election, in comparison to the 76% of people aged 31 to 46 and 82% of people 47 and older who shared the same voting likelihood. Understanding politics and voting can also be associated with further civic action, which is, according to an article from World Vision, quote, advocacy and opportunities that help youth take a bolder action to create a positive change within their society, end quote. They found that in the last 4 elections, Canadian youth have had the smallest turnout, 66% compared to the overall 76%. They also found that, quote, youth are the most politically vocal demographic in Canada, end quote. This makes us ask the question, why is voter turnout lower with youth than with other demographics if they are the most outspoken about political issues and beliefs? The World Vision article answers this question by stating that youth do not believe that voting is an effective method to share their political opinions or to effect change. They state that, quote, political parties fail to cater their platforms that appeal to youth. Youth have specific concerns, but these concerns are often unrepresented in party platforms, end quote. Here with me today, I have Kai, who is a prospective politician. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to just start by asking you some questions. My first question is, what caused you to gain interest in politics?
I think my political origin story, like a lot of people my age, 17, 18, 19 years old, really begins with the 2019 Canadian election, which happened a few years ago. It was around that time I really started getting into Canadian politics because it was just a very hot political time, so to speak. I really got into it around the summer. I had my first campaign during then. There were many elections that were happening. I remember Alberta had just come out of an election in the spring, which had the UCP and Jason Kenney win a majority government. And it was in September that Manitoba was having a provincial election that saw the re-election of Brian Pallister and the PCs. And then, of course, that fall was also the 2019 Canadian election, which was like really the start of the Trudeau saga or the Trudeau years in terms of the elections. Because that election really had a defining moment where it kind of reshaped the political landscape here in Canada. And there was just so much happening, you could not ignore it, and I was really getting into it. I discovered a few YouTube channels that really broke down Canadian politics in a digestible way that made it like easy for me to get into. I credit JJ McCullough, who has very good basic Canadian tutorials and goes over conventional wisdom and that sort of thing, for introducing me to conventional wisdom with the Canadian political landscape, and then just developing that further. A lot was happening that summer. I also got Twitter that summer, so I was very involved, and there was just a lot of discussion happening online about the election, particularly about what Canada's place in the world was going to be and the direction of the country. It had been the first election that the Liberals were facing in terms of their re-election, and it was a really defining moment for the future of the Conservative Party, the future of the NDP, future of course, Liberals and Trudeau and all that. And then from there, after that election, politics never slowed down. I remember my mother asking me, what are you going to do after October 21st? I'm like, well, it doesn't stop just because the election is over. So, I kept following that. Provincial elections kept happening. Municipal elections kept happening. We had another federal election, and really that show never stopped. So I kept staying engaged with it and developing my interest further, developing my knowledge further on those topics. And that leads us basically to where we are today.
So it was a lot of external influence, the surrounding environment, a lot of what was going on just in the political climate generally that was influencing your interest in politics.
It was, yeah. I would say a lot of people become politically self-aware in the time of high school and university college, mainly because issues relating to their day-to-day lives play a larger role on them, so they're just exposed to it more. I
Mhm.
started a bit early, like I started my freshman year or my rising freshman year going into high school, getting into Canadian politics. So I had a little bit of a head start, if you want to call it that. But like there was just so much happening that you couldn't not ignore it. And I found it interesting, found it captivating, interesting people, interesting issues, particularly
Mhm.
relating to energy and debt. And like I said, Canada's place on the world stage. So it was a very engaging time, so to speak.
For sure. And I know that you've been involved in a lot of campaigning and stuff with your local leaders and local electives. Can you give some information on what you've been doing in that regard?
Yeah, my first campaign was with Jeff Wharton and the Manitoba PC Party. That was that summer, the summer of 2019, with the last Manitoba provincial election. Essentially, I saw Jeff one day having a sign waving on, I think it was Henderson Highway, where he's like, honk for Jeff. And I was like, Mom, honk the car. And after that, I kind of just emailed the campaign and just asked them, like, what riding do I live in? Because they had done a whole redistribution thing. I didn't know if Schuler or Jeff was my MLA. And then after that, I kind of tagged along on a few campaigns, handed out leaflets and this sort of thing. I was very young, so he didn't make me do much at the time aside from, be there, be a presence. I remember I got a lanyard. He gave me a little volunteer sign. It was a lot of fun. And then in 2021, when we had the most recent federal campaign, I volunteered with the federal Tories on Raquel Dancho's campaign. I had met her in Ottawa, I think 2 years prior. She remembered me and she decided to give me a slot on that volunteer team. Met a lot of fun people, a lot of young people in particular, a lot of lifelong friends, very smart people as well. And it was always a lot of fun being on those campaigns. I remember I would do that in between working and particularly in between school, before and after, and on the weekends and that sort of thing.
Mhm. And is this kind of an opportunity, something you'd recommend to other youth who are interested in getting involved in politics?
Um, it's an interesting thing because the kinds of young people you find in politics, either the kinds who want to advance particular issues or the kind who are perhaps more similar with me, in which the politicians, the atmosphere is kind of uh, interesting in that sort of sense. If you're like me and you find politics an interesting thing to observe and participate in, and you like all the aspects of it, I would say best place to start would be local representatives. There's always an election around the corner at some time. So we live in Manitoba, right? And the upcoming election is next October. There's a perfect opportunity then to volunteer on any number of campaigns. We have many parties, so there's many options for you. There's always many candidates running. And a lot of these campaigns, they're looking for volunteers and particularly young people, both on the right and the left, looking for youth support. So if you're young and engaged and like smart, so to speak, and you just kind of ask them, hey, can I help on the campaign or can I come by? They would be more than happy to have you. And they always enjoy working with youth on the campaigns and even after that.
Well, that's great to hear. My next question is, what aspects of politics do you personally find the most important?
I think when you talk about politics, it can really be split up into like different sections because like when most people think about it, it's just kind of the politicians and the issues. And I would say like most people just kind of debate the issues, is this policy good or bad? What is its impact? But then there's the other side of it, which is like the math and the data of polling and campaigns and strategy and that sort of thing. And if you really want to think about politics as like a governmental thing separate from policy and more towards like the candidates, the people, and the parties. Having a multi-party political system in Canada, I think, has been a good benefit to our country,
Mhm.
particularly when you look at other countries,
Mhm.
mainly the United States, as I'm alluding to here,
Yeah.
in which you have only two parties and it's kind of just the same stuff all the time. The
Mhm.
multi-party system does allow for more dynamics. It is more interesting that way. It gives voters more um, options for representation. It makes elections
Hmm.
more competitive and more engaging. There's many dynamics at play, right? We have a conservative party that will float anywhere from a populist direction to a very moderate direction. You have the liberals as our natural governing party,
Hmm.
which has floated everywhere from into the woods with the Dion Ignatieff years to governing in minority parliaments with Trudeau now. You have the NDP, which has gone everywhere from opposition to rock bottom. You have the Bloc and a separatist um, wing to Canadian politics, environmental politics, even far right politics. So there are many elements to it, and there's parties that represent it. So I always think the multi-party system is a very good thing. We
Hmm.
also have, I wouldn't describe it as a robust niche political culture, but it is definitely prominent, which is to say, like, if you think about other countries like the UK or the United States, politics is almost like a reality show. Like, it's on all the time. It's on all the news, pundits all the time. What does this mean for these people? What does that mean for the next election? You have a slightly less of that in Canada, but the kinds of people who do engage with that are quite smart people. There are a number of podcasts that I highly recommend to people that talk about everything from campaign strategy to the numbers of politics to the issues themselves. Most of these people are ex-strategists or ex-staffers and are very smart. It's a very tight-knit community, people online as well. Always happy to have discussions, always happy to learn and build off of each other and just
Hmm.
discuss these things in more detail. So there is a very close, tight-knit community of people interested in Canadian politics, which, breeds a sense of community with people, and that's always a nice thing to see.
For sure. And I mean, just in reference to what you were talking about with the multi-party system, I think when we
Mhm.
look at a country like the United States, which has just the binary system with Democrat versus Republican, you see a lot more social divide too. And that causes some not issues, but it creates an interesting change in politics and in social situations that you don't see in countries like Canada where we have the multi-party system, which I think is something really interesting to consider.
Mhm. It's also a notable thing, like if you're going to get into U.S. politics, which of course there's many people who are into it because of course it's
Mhm.
the most dominant political country in the entire world. It's kind of hard when the divide is just this or that.
Yeah,
There's not a lot of niche, there's not a lot of speciality or specifics, so it's kind of like, well, if I'm not into either of them, it's kind of hard to latch on because it's more or
for
less
sure.
just the same thing repeated. Multi-party system, I think, is one of the great benefits of our country.
Mhm. And I mean, my understanding of the political situation in the US is that they're kind of in not a standstill per se, but for a lack of better words, a standstill where a lot of people are stuck voting for the same party because there aren't other options. There isn't an in between the two parties. And they're kind of almost set in like a social, I've always voted for this party. I'm not
Mhm.
changing my vote. I'm not moving away from it. And it gets interesting in that sense too, because it almost seems to provide a lack of, I mean, it does provide a lack of options, but it also provides a lack of choice.
And that's the good thing about competitive party system. Like, elections are quite fluid. Like, if you look
Mhm.
at British Columbia, right now it's quite dominated by the NDP and more progressive parties. But there was a time when the Canadian Alliance and the Conservatives were very dominant. Alberta
Mhm.
used to be this fortress for the Conservatives, and now the NDP is a viable option there. Saskatchewan used to be a fortress for the NDP, and now it's a fortress for the Conservatives. Manitoba is very competitive. Ontario is all over the board. Quebec is, the wild card in Canadian politics. Even the Atlantic has gone blue in recent elections. So it's all over the place. It can change all the time. It's not
Mhm.
like in the United States where, oh, I am in Wyoming and Wyoming will always be Republican until, the heat death of the universe. Here we have more parties. It is more competitive and it is a lot of fun to observe.
Exactly. And I think that's part of that engagement piece you were talking about. Like, Wyoming is generally going to always have the same result at the end of the day. They're going to have the same political party come out on top, same as most other states. There are a couple of swing states, but for the most part, they're all pretty consistent. And I think that does
Mhm.
take some of the engagement part with others out of it. And it's harder for citizens to engage in the political atmosphere when it's not as not entertaining, but not as engaging in general, right? There's not as much to engage with.
Mhm.
My next question for you is, how do you see the political state of Canada at this moment in time?
I have to regretfully say that it is not in the best place in terms of where it once was. Like I would say Canadian politics has become quite dry and negative as of late. Um, like just personally speaking, I remember last year I would read the news every day on the bus ride to school. And I had like 40 different news sites I would launch with that one button on Google Chrome where it's like launch every tab open, right, from my bookmarks folder. And I had like mainstream papers and niche papers and like left-wing papers and right-wing papers, and I would read all of it. I don't do that anymore because a lot of the things are just the same, which is to say they're all the same stuff about the liberals and their economic policy or the conservatives and their direction in the next election, which I feel it's very repetitive. Part of that is just we're coming off of the back of the pandemic politics stuff. So,
Mhm.
inflation, cost of living is all because of pandemic spending. And then, more social, political polarization and this sort of thing because of pandemic politics. So that's the state of the Tories right now. And it's just like, it's more or less the same. It's not in a great place right now. So I wouldn't say I've been turned off by it, but it's definitely been better. Like I find myself a little bit nostalgic for um, the 2019 period, definitely the Trudeau majority years when we had a lot happening then, the Harper years for sure. I've been just going back, reading articles, Wikipedia, and reading books and these sorts of things of politics in like the 80s and 90s during the mega constitutional period. It's like that was very fun and interesting to read, even though it was perhaps a little bit detrimental to the country. But it was an engaging period, and we don't really see a lot of that
Mhm.
anymore. Even with the Harper years and the Trudeau majority, a lot more was happening politically, issues based, than we really see now. Now it just seems a little bit too repetitive, a little bit negative. It's a slump, and Canadian politics will get out of it, but just as it stands now, not really in the best place.
Mhm. In terms of the pandemic politics, what do you think needs to be done to come away from that and move back into a more, I guess, quote unquote, normal sense of politics in Canada?
Last June, Doug Ford won a second majority government, and a lot of people credit his landslide success to the fact that that election was not very focused on pandemic. Like Ford really wanted to just move the province forward, forget what happened during those dark days, and just like look optimistically to the future. And a lot of people were convinced by him, and he was rewarded with a even larger majority government. I think with pandemic politics, the more we look back, the more influence it'll have, and just memories will fade as we just move further on in time. So when we get new leaders of the major parties, and maybe in 5 or 10 years, it'll be a different state. I think we're just in this cycle now because it was very recent. Like the pandemic only nominally started to fade from people's memories, even like last spring when Ford did his majority kind of thing. It is just a process that will take a little bit of time, but looking forward and not focusing on the past is probably the best thing to do, which is the issues of tomorrow, the issues of next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, as
Mhm.
opposed to relitigating issues from, a few years ago. That would probably be the best thing to move on.
And what would you say those issues of tomorrow would be considered right now?
The ironic thing is that the issues of tomorrow are probably the issues from before the pandemic, which is to say, yes, economic policy, but it's more to do with debt and deficit rather than inflationary stuff, which is more connected to the pandemic. Energy issues, federalism, which has to do with Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the Saskatchewan First Act and the Alberta Sovereignty Act and the place of Quebec in the Federation right now. So federalism issues for sure. Of course, the environment is like that big
Mhm.
one as well. But those would be the issues of tomorrow, as opposed to saying, lockdowns or masks and mask mandates and vaccine passports and this sort of thing. The more we focus on the past, the nastier politics really becomes. And as Ford
Mhm.
proved, and as many people prove, the more you look forward, the more optimistic things can be.
Absolutely. And just while talking about the issues of tomorrow, what do you think politicians need to target their campaigns towards to appeal to the leaders of tomorrow, which are current youth?
I think that the issues that young people care about are quite similar to the issues that most Canadians care about, which does have to do with economics. I think most people want to have more money left in their pockets, with lower taxes, and better financial support so that they're able to, buy a home and support family and raise kids and these sorts of things, particularly if you're young in your 20s and 30s, right? After university, what are you going to do, right? You don't want to go home and live with mom and dad. You want to be able to buy your own home. That's very difficult nowadays given high housing prices. So solving an issue like housing is a very positive thing there. Immigration's a big thing too, making sure that we're able to have supports for new Canadians. People want to come to Canada. There's a reason why, because we're a great country, the best country in the world. So let's have those supports for those kinds of people, and just generally support all kinds of Canadians with those kind of policies. Lower taxes helps them. Tackling housing helps them. Supporting new Canadians is always a beneficial thing. Investing in healthcare so that we can have a sustainable healthcare system. These are all issues that, Canadians, whether they're 20 years old or whether they're 50, 60 years old, care about.
For sure. And then my next question is, what changes do you want to see not only in the political system, but also in our government in the future?
We talked a lot about like the culture of politics, the way they interact, the campaigns and that, but just like institutionally, and this gets even more niche when it comes to political discussions. Recently here in Manitoba, we had a mayoral election and well, I guess municipal elections across the whole province and the RMs and everything. And if you just look at the voter turnout, it is abysmally low for the number of people who are running. You had numerous incumbents winning by default because no one wanted to challenge them. You had mayoral candidates and city councilor candidates winning by very small margins because of vote splits. And I feel, and this is something that not everyone will agree with, but I feel that maybe a party system on the municipal level would be beneficial. Which is to say, a lot of people, when you ask them, who did you vote for in a municipal election, that they're not engaged with, right? They're not following the campaign. They don't know the candidates. They tend to vote based off of name recognition. So, like, if I just think to myself, yes, I am into politics, but I did not follow the election in my RM particularly closely. I remember there were two candidates in my ward. One guy had like a Ukrainian last name, and the other guy just don't remember. If I was voting, I would probably be inclined to vote for the guy with the Ukrainian last name, even though I don't know the other guy or any of the candidates, just because of name recognition, because I've seen his sign before. And I don't really think that's a healthy thing in a democracy.
Mhm.
And yes, people will say that, having non-affiliated or independent candidates, takes party politics out of it and allows more bipartisanship and this sort of thing. But I think that if you're going to have voters vote for local candidates, I would much rather they vote on the basis of parties, which they do on
Mhm.
the other two levels, rather than just name recognition. Same with school trustee, same with counselors and mayor and this sort of thing.
Mhm.
Having party labels tied to it, it decreases something like a ballot with 14 candidates on it because that's overkill. And it allows voters to have a better sense of what candidates stand for.
Mhm.
So, we could say, Scott Gillingham, he's kind of a more moderate conservative kind of fella. If you knew he had a party label attached to him, because he used to run as a PC candidate in Manitoba years ago, if you had known what party he is, nominally attached to, you'd be more inclined to vote because you know what the party more broadly supports. And thus you'd have more voter engagement and more engagement with municipal politics more broadly.
I for sure agree with the fact that people should be able to vote based off of what someone stands for rather than just the fact that they recognize the name. But
Mhm.
are there any other ways to do that without tying them to parties specifically, or is that one of the only solutions that we have?
People will optimistically say, well, let's get the voters engaged with the issues, but it's been tried, sometimes successfully, but it does not seem to have worked. And I think this is just kind of a way that is simple and effective because, like, the reality is most municipal politicians and candidates have some sort of ties to one of the other parties. So, like, Kevin Klein was a mayoral candidate here in Winnipeg, and he is now a PC MLA. So you can like firmly say that he is a conservative nominally, right? And
Mhm.
Glenn Murray was like a federal liberal and a federal green and a provincial liberal in Ontario. So like you can firmly say he's a progressive candidate. But
Mhm.
had you not known that, because most people don't, right? Because most people don't follow the results that closely, it would be better for them to be able to say, okay, I support the party. I know what the party stands for, progressive values or conservative values, and then vote along those lines, even if they
Mhm.
don't know what the candidate specifically supports. And thus you have more engagement. Because like when you
Mhm.
poll people and you ask them like who's your MP or who's your MLA, some do, but a sad amount like don't, and most people
Mhm.
just say that they voted for the Liberal, NDP, or PC candidate in the last election, and they don't actually know like who the local candidate is. And I think that if you want more people engaged as just like a first step, maybe tie that to parties. Like it is not something I don't think that will happen, but it is just an idea to be thrown out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mhm. And my last question is, are there any other comments you want to make regarding the political situation or the importance of politics for youth?
I would say it is generally a good thing when young people are interested in politics or young people interested in anything for that matter, right? Being
Mhm.
dedicated, being interested in it, seeing a career path in it, following it, I think is a very beneficial thing. It's healthy for democracy because it shows that, as you said, yes, the leaders of tomorrow care about the issues that are going to be concerning them in the years to come. But it is also just something that is generally it's an interest for me in a very abstract way. I like following the elections. I like following the maps and the candidates and the people and the parties and all of that. And I think it's a very beneficial thing. Yes, as I said, maybe it's not in the best place right now, but I know it's going to get out of this. People can learn a lot about Canadian history, the history of their province and their city by studying politics. Right, that's how I learned a lot about Canadian history, but was
Mhm.
through politics. And I think just having more people knowing about it and engaged in it is a healthy thing in a representative democracy like ours.
For sure. Yes. Thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for your insight. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Lauren, for having me.